Dad promised to take us both, me and my younger brother Kyle, on this road trip he'd been talking about since spring. It wasn't just some casual drive either. He'd called it a long overdue adventure, like it was supposed to fix something unspoken. He had maps printed out, playlists burned on CDs even though no one uses CDs anymore, and even mentioned stopping by that old bait shop near Lake Guntersville, like when we were kids. I didn't ask questions. I just nodded, told him I'd take the weekend off work, and packed my bag with a pair of boots, a flashlight, and 2 sets of clothes that didn't smell like diesel. That Friday morning, I woke up before my alarm, something I hadn't done in years. I was almost giddy, in that ridiculous way grown men don't like to admit to. The coffee was fresh, the morning was cool, and the sky had that soft orange pink you only get for maybe 10 minutes before the sun fully kicks in. I walked out to the driveway, bag in hand, heart light, and then I stopped. There were 2 things in front of me: Dad's old Chevy Suburban idling in the driveway, and Kyle standing by the passenger side, tossing his duffel in the back like it was just another Tuesday. My heart stuttered. My bag wasn't in the back. Hell, the back was half empty except for Kyle's gym-looking thing and a cooler I didn't pack. I stood there, blinking like I had missed a cue or something. Dad leaned out the driver's side window and gave me this half-assed smile, the kind that never touched his eyes. "Thought you'd want to sleep in," he said, as if that explained anything. That was it. No apology, no confusion, no offer to throw my stuff in the back. Just Kyle in the car, me on the porch, and the sound of the engine humming like nothing was wrong. That moment hit like a goddamn freight train. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a miscommunication. It was a choice. They were leaving, and I wasn't part of it. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, just holding my duffel like a dog waiting for its leash. Then Kyle gave me this awkward little wave, probably more guilt than joy, and the Suburban rolled out like nothing ever happened. No tire screech, no looking back. I didn't even go inside at first. I just sat down on the porch steps, tossed the bag next to me, and cracked open a beer, yes, at 7:30 in the morning. You ever sit there feeling so stupid, you almost convince yourself it's your fault? Like maybe you didn't pack fast enough, or maybe you missed some subtle family rule no one said out loud. But nah, this was deliberate. This was familiar. This was Dad. Have you ever had someone close to you make you feel invisible, like you just weren't chosen? Tell me in the comments. I'm curious how many of us have lived in someone else's shadow. See, growing up, it was always Kyle first. When I made the team, Dad said, "Good job." When Kyle made the team, Dad bought a grill and threw burgers on for the whole block. When I brought home a solid B+ in algebra, he said, "Try harder." Kyle brought home a C, and somehow that meant, "Numbers just ain't your thing, champ." I used to make excuses for him. He was a tough guy. A war vet. Someone who didn't know how to show love unless it was through hard labor or grudging nods. But this wasn't the first time I'd been left behind. It was just the first time it was so obvious. So I sat there and drank that beer and looked out over the empty road, wondering what it would take for me to stop pretending like this wasn't a pattern. I thought about Mom, too. She used to say Ron, that's Dad loved his own way. Whatever that meant. She passed when I was 24, cancer, fast and mean. She was the only one who ever pulled him back into anything like tenderness. After she died, the house got quieter. So did Dad. And so did I. After sitting on that step for an hour, I stood up, took my bag inside, dropped it by the front door like it was something I might still use later. I opened the fridge, empty except for some Chinese leftovers and cheap beer. I wasn't even mad. I just felt stupid. Again. But then, I don't know why, maybe because I needed to feel close to someone, I went to that old cedar dresser in the hallway closet. The one nobody had touched since we boxed up Mom's stuff. I opened the top drawer, and there it was, a sealed envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges, my name written in curling cursive. For when he forgets you again. My hands were shaking. I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I put it down gently on the table and stared at it like it might explode. It was like Mom had known this day would come. Hell, maybe it had already come 100 times before and I was just now ready to admit it. That envelope changed something. It was like she reached forward through time to pat my shoulder and say, "Don't let them get away with this." I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew I wasn't just going to spend the weekend feeling sorry for myself. No, if they could leave me out, I could start rewriting the story. So I picked up a pen and wrote 3 words on a sticky note I slapped to the fridge. Make it count. And for once, I didn't mean for anyone else. I couldn't stop thinking about it, even hours after the Suburban had disappeared down the road like a ghost from the past, fading into that soft morning light while I stood there like a leftover thought. I kept going over the moment in my head, like a broken cassette tape, clicking and spinning through the same stretch of silence. The look on Dad's face, that casual dismissal, the kind that didn't need raised voices or slammed doors to feel like a punch in the gut. It was the sort of look that tells you, without any words, that you just don't belong. I didn't open Mom's letter right away, and I sure as hell didn't unpack my bag. The duffel sat in the hallway like it was grieving something, like it had been cheated out of its own road trip. I stared at it for a while, hands in my pockets, pacing back and forth like the living room floor was some courtroom, and I was preparing a case that nobody was going to hear. That envelope sat on the kitchen table like a dare. But before I could bring myself to open it, I grabbed my keys and headed over to Tucker's. Tucker's been my best friend since I was 10. We met at a minor league game our dads took us to. Funny how that detail feels ironic now. He's the kind of guy who's always got beer in the fridge and a folding chair in the back of his truck just in case someone needs to sit and talk about life for a couple hours. When I walked into his garage, he barely looked up from under the hood of his Camaro before saying, "You look like someone who just found out the will's rigged." I laughed, even though it wasn't funny. He handed me a cold beer and pointed to the rusted-out lawn chair by the tool rack. "Go on," he said, like he already knew the whole story, but wanted to hear me say it out loud. And so I did. I told him about the car, the missing bag, the way Dad barely looked at me when they drove off. I told him how I wasn't even mad in the moment, just blank. Like I was watching someone else's life. Tucker took a swig, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and said, "Dude, your dad's been like that since the 90s. You just never wanted to see it." His voice wasn't cruel. It was plain, like he was reading off a service manual. He always had a soft spot for Kyle. You were the one that got the tough love, and Kyle got the actual love. It stung, hearing it out loud like that. I wanted to argue, say there were times Dad showed up, times he gave a damn. But the more I thought about it, the more hollow those memories felt. I remembered the year Kyle turned 16 and Dad surprised him with a brand new Dodge Dakota. I'd gotten a clunker when I hit the same age, some rust bucket Ford Ranger with half a bumper and a cassette deck that ate tapes like candy. I told myself at the time that Dad wanted me to learn the value of hard work. But now it felt like a nice way of justifying second place. And then there was the Little League game, the championship one I played when I was 12. I'd hit the winning double, the kind of hit that feels like your soul's on fire. I looked toward the bleachers for him, expecting a fist in the air or at least a proud nod. But his seat was empty. Later he told me he got caught up with work, that it couldn't be helped. Kyle's games? Never missed a single one. Sitting in that garage with Tucker, I started wondering if maybe this road trip thing was just the straw that finally cracked the dam. This wasn't about a missed weekend or an empty car seat. This was about every invisible moment stacked up over the last 3 decades, each one adding weight until the whole damn thing buckled. Maybe it's not about him choosing Kyle, I said. Maybe it's just about him not choosing me. Tucker looked at me for a long second, his eyes narrowing a bit like he was inspecting a spark plug. Or maybe it's about you finally choosing yourself. That one hit hard. Like, sink into your gut hard. I stayed there for a couple more beers, letting the silence stretch out until it was almost comfortable. Then I drove home, not because I had something to do, but because I had to sit with everything. I pulled into the driveway, walked through the front door, and looked around like I was seeing my house for the first time in months. Nothing had moved. The bag was still there. The envelope still sat where I left it. The silence felt louder now. I walked down the hall to the den, where we used to hang family photos. There's a long wall with wooden paneling, the kind that hasn't been in style since the early 80s. I ran my hand across the frames, studying the faces. Kyle was in almost everyone. Sometimes twice. There he was at his graduation at Christmas, holding his firstborn. My pictures? Fewer. Smaller. One was crooked, and I left it that way. That wall told a story I didn't want to hear before, but I was listening now. This wasn't some one-off screw-up. This was a lifetime pattern. It had always been there, camouflaged in smiles, buried in traditions, dressed up like discipline. And I had let it go on, hoping one day it would shift in my favor. I pulled out my phone, hands still a little shaky, and typed a message I never thought I'd send. Hope the trip is worth it. Hope he tells you the truth. And then I hit send. No signature. No love you. No period even. Then I went back to the kitchen, stared down at that envelope from Mom again, and whispered to myself, tomorrow. I'll open it tomorrow. Because for the first time, I wanted to be ready. The envelope had been sitting on my kitchen table like a loaded gun, silent, heavy, full of whatever truths my mom had never said while she was alive. I didn't touch it for 2 days. I walked past it, stared at it, drank beer next to it like it was some kind of shrine or cursed artifact. Every time I thought about opening it, I'd find an excuse to do something else, clean the garage, reorganize my toolbox, even pull weeds out of the backyard like I gave a damn about landscaping all of a sudden. I think deep down, I knew once I opened that letter, I wouldn't be able to go back to pretending. Not about Dad, not about Kyle, and not about the version of our family I'd tried for years to keep alive in my head. Sunday morning hit different. The house was too quiet. The silence had a texture, like it was pressing down on me, daring me to break it. I made a strong cup of coffee, the kind that kicks you in the teeth, and sat down at the table like I was clocking in for something serious. I stared at the envelope again. For when he forgets you again. The way she wrote that again told me everything I didn't want to hear. I tore it open slow, careful not to rip her handwriting. Her scent wasn't on it anymore, just the old paper must that somehow still punched me in the chest. The letter was short, maybe a page and a half, written in blue ink with tiny flourishes I recognized from every birthday card she'd ever slipped under my door. Jake, she'd started, and already my throat tightened. If you're reading this, it means he's hurt you again. Maybe not with his fists or his voice, but with that quiet way he does, where you're left sitting there wondering what you did wrong, even though deep down you know it's not you. I had to stop reading for a second, let the words settle in like shrapnel. I could see her in my mind so clearly curled up on that worn corduroy chair in the den, cup of tea in hand, scribbling this down while Dad probably watched some war documentary on mute in the background. I used to think he'd grow out of it, that once you boys got older, he'd learn to show up the way he never did for himself. I thought maybe having sons would pull something warm out of him. But some men, Jake, are stuck in the mud of who raised them. And your father, well, I think he was always trying to earn love too, just in the wrong way. She wrote about Kyle, too, not in a harsh way, but honest. Your brother was always easier for him. Less questions. Less fight. You challenged him in ways that scared him, and instead of growing from that, he pushed you away. I saw it. I tried to balance it out. But love isn't math. You can't subtract from one child and add to another and call it even. I read that line 3 times before folding the letter and pressing it to my chest like a man trying to hold something inside from spilling out. I didn't cry, not fully, but something in my chest cracked in a way I couldn't ignore. That letter wasn't just a warning, it was permission. Permission to stop chasing something I was never going to catch. Permission to be pissed off, not just at Dad, but at the whole damn machine that kept running even when I was left behind. Later that afternoon, I climbed up into the attic with a flashlight and pulled down the old Rubbermaid bin that held some of my junk from middle school, dusty yearbooks, cracked cassette tapes, a baseball mitt that still had my name stitched into the leather. Buried at the bottom was a notebook, one of those wide-ruled things with fraying edges and covers you could peel like sunburned skin. I flipped it open and found journal entries I barely remembered writing, but every word hit like a stone. One entry stopped me cold. Dated June 4th, 2001. I was 13. It read, "I think I'm just his practice son." Like he's figuring out how to be a dad on me before he gets it right with Kyle. Maybe if I mess up less, he'll treat me better. But today he called me dramatic for crying when I got benched. Said I needed thicker skin. I wish I had different skin. Maybe then he'd like me more. Reading that as a grown man felt like being punched in the gut by my own past. That was the part that really got me, not just the pain of the words, but the familiarity. I hadn't just thought those things as a kid. I had built entire coping mechanisms around them. I had structured my relationships, my career, even my divorce, around the same damn dynamic, trying to win approval that was always just out of reach. I sat there in that attic for a long time, holding that journal like a relic, surrounded by dusty memories and the faint creak of a house that had seen too much silence. I didn't know what to do next. There wasn't some big aha moment or dramatic decision to burn it all down. It was quieter than that. A kind of resolve started to form, not loud, not angry, just a shift. I realized I didn't want to feel this way when I was 70. I didn't want to carry this story like an infection. I came down from the attic and went straight to the kitchen. Grabbed a pen and wrote 3 words at the top of a notebook page, things they never expected. Then I started listing. Not revenge plans, not petty jabs, just truths I was tired of holding back. Things like, I remember everything. And he never said sorry. And you were always the golden boy, and you knew it. My hand shook, but the words kept flowing. I didn't know what I'd do with the list, but it felt like building a foundation, something solid to stand on. I picked up my phone, scrolled to Kyle's number, and pressed call. It rang 4 times, then hit voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I stared at the phone, shook my head, and put it down. If he wanted to hear from me, he'd have to call back. I looked down at my list again, at all the words I was finally letting out, and thought, this time, I'm not going to stay quiet just to keep the peace. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something like control. Not joy, not forgiveness, but clarity. That was enough for now. There's a strange kind of weight that builds up in a house when no one's talking to each other, like every corner starts echoing the silence back at you in a way that's almost louder than noise. By Wednesday, I couldn't shake that pressure, and I knew I wasn't going to make it another week without saying something to Dad. Not to fix it, not to smooth things over, but because the things sitting in my chest were starting to rot from the inside out, and if I didn't get them out, I was going to carry that stink for the rest of my damn life. I didn't plan anything fancy. I didn't sit down and map out a script. I just poured a strong cup of coffee, stood in the middle of my living room with the curtains pulled open like I needed light for what was coming, and dialed his number with the kind of quiet resolve you get before walking into a fight you know you probably won't win. It rang twice before he picked up, his voice rough and casual like nothing was wrong. "Jake," he said, and that was it. No, how's it going? No, sorry I forgot you existed last weekend. Just my name like it was the start of a sentence he didn't want to finish. I swallowed hard, heart beating fast for no reason other than old reflexes. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice light. "Just checking in. Wanted to see how the trip went." He paused for a second, barely, but long enough that I knew he was choosing his words. "Good drive," he said. "Kyle," and I hit the old spots. River looked low, but it's been a dry spring. I leaned against the wall, staring at the floor. "Yeah, wish I could have seen it." Another pause. Longer this time. Then he said, "Didn't think you were interested in long drives anymore." "You've been busy." That sentence felt like a gut punch wearing a polite smile. I stood there, stunned by how casual he could make betrayal sound. "Didn't think I was interested?" I repeated, and my voice cracked a little, more from shock than anger. "Dad, I packed my bag 3 days in advance." I cleared my whole damn weekend. What part of that says, not interested to you? He gave this low grunt, the kind of sound he makes when he's uncomfortable but won't admit it. Didn't want to make a big deal of it. Figured it'd be easier. Easier for who? I snapped, finally letting the frustration push its way through. For you? For Kyle? What about me, huh? You think it's easy waking up to find out you've been left behind without even a goddamn conversation. There was silence on the line, the kind that stretches and sours. Then he sighed, like I was being unreasonable. You always read too deep into things, Jake. Not everything's a slight. That was it. That's the switch. That's the line he always uses when he wants to pretend nothing's wrong, when he wants to twist your hurt into some kind of personal failing. I'd heard that tone my whole life, dismissive, cold, the verbal equivalent of turning your back and pretending the person talking isn't worth your time. You never gave me a damn chance to be interested, I shouted, louder than I meant to, the words echoing off the drywall like gunshots. You never asked. You never checked. You just decided I wouldn't care and cut me out, like you always do. And you don't even see it, do you? You've been doing it since I was a kid, and I let it slide, but this time, I saw it for what it is. Another pause, but this one didn't feel like hesitation. It felt like a wall slamming into place. I'm sorry you feel that way, he said finally, and those words were worse than silence. They were the end of the road, dressed up like sympathy. They meant nothing. They were the emotional equivalent of spitting on a cut and calling it medicine. I didn't know what I expected him to say. Maybe some flicker of regret, some hint that he'd thought about it. But all I got was that dry, deadpan voice and a carefully packaged non-apology that told me everything I needed to know. I gotta go, he said, already pulling away. Talk later. And just like that, the call ended. He didn't even wait for a response. He hung up, and the line went dead in my ear, like the conversation had never even happened. I stood there for a long time, the phone still in my hand, heart pounding like I'd run a marathon. I didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't punch anything, though all of those options buzzed through my muscles like sparks looking for firewood. Instead, I just sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the surface until my vision blurred, and reached for a pen. I grabbed a notepad and started writing, not journaling, not venting, but building something. At first, it was just messy lines, half-formed thoughts, pieces of sentences that didn't have a home yet. But eventually, it started to come together like bones under skin. I was writing a speech. Not for a crowd. Not even for him. For me. I wrote about the baseball game he missed when I was 12, and the way he said, "Didn't matter, did it?" when I asked where he was. I wrote about the year Kyle got a brand new bike, and I got the one with the rusty chain and bent handlebars. I wrote about the day Mom died, and how he didn't cry, not once, and how I thought that made him strong until I realized it just made him empty. The speech wasn't pretty. It didn't have an arc or a tidy moral. It was raw and ugly and soaked in everything I'd been holding back for 30 years. But it was mine. And when I finished it, I looked up at the calendar hanging by the fridge, the one with the pictures of old trucks and outdated barbecue tips. I flipped ahead, circled a date 1 week out, and wrote 2 words in all caps across the white space. Cabin confrontation. I wasn't sure what would happen when that day came. I didn't know if I was going there to scream, to cry, or just to be heard for once in my life. But I knew this, next time we were in the same room, I wasn't walking out silent. Not this time. Not again. I wasn't exactly sure why I ended up on Sandra's porch that Thursday afternoon, standing there with a bottle of halfway decent bourbon in one hand and a head full of fog. But something in me knew it was time to hear a version of my story that didn't come from my own damn head. There's only so much you can say to yourself before it starts to feel like echo, and I needed someone who knew the Jake behind the defenses, someone who'd seen the parts of me I didn't like showing to the mirror. And Sandra, for better or worse, had seen it all. We hadn't talked in a real way since the divorce 3 years back, the kind of divorce where the lawyers do more speaking than the actual couple and most of the final conversations happen through unsigned birthday cards and brief text replies about mortgage crap. She lived on the east side now, a nicer neighborhood, one of those quiet streets with trimmed hedges and wind chimes that sound like they were tuned by a therapist. She opened the door barefoot, hair pulled back in a messy knot, and gave me a look that was part confusion, part cautious welcome. "Jake?" she asked, like I might have been a ghost or some door-to-door scam artist who just happened to share my face. I held up the bottle and shrugged. "I come in peace," I said. "And I need a little honesty from someone who doesn't owe me a damn thing." She let me in, barefoot pads slapping against the hardwood floor as she led me to the kitchen. It hadn't changed much, same white counters, same plants on the windowsill, same clock ticking too loudly like it was keeping score. We sat at the kitchen table where we used to argue over bills and whether or not to have kids, and she poured us both a drink like it was some old ritual we'd forgotten the meaning of. "So," she said, watching me over the rim of her glass, "who do I need to tell you the truth about? Your dad? Kyle? Yourself?" I laughed, but it was empty. "All of the above, maybe. Something's broken, and I need to know how long it's been broken and whether I ever had a shot at fixing it." She leaned back, letting the bourbon sit on her tongue before swallowing. "It's been broken since before we met, Jake. You just didn't want to see it." Hell, maybe I didn't either. There was a pause, not the awkward kind, but the kind where the air gets dense because you know something heavy is coming. Then she looked me right in the eye and said it as plainly as a weather report. "You married me to fix a hole your dad left. But I was never enough to patch it." I didn't flinch, but it hit like a goddamn truck. Not because I hadn't heard something like that before, but because this time I actually heard it. I let it land. I didn't throw up a wall or some defensive joke about daddy issues. I just sat there and let the truth settle like dust on a windowsill that hadn't been touched in years. She kept going, not cruel, but firm. "You always needed someone to clap for you. Bosses, friends, me, hell, even strangers. You needed validation like air. You walked around like if somebody didn't tell you were doing okay, then you weren't. And when I didn't do it enough, or the right way, you shut down. You didn't blow up, you shut off." "I didn't know," I said quietly, but she shook her head. "You knew," she said, voice soft but sharp. "You just thought you could outwork it. Like if you fixed enough cars or paid enough bills or held it together better than your old man ever did, someone would look at you and say, 'Good job, Jake. You're enough.' But he never said it, did he?" I shook my head. "Not once. And that's why this whole thing with Kyle, this road trip, this bag on the porch moment, it's not just about now. It's about every time he chose Kyle and you smiled like it didn't hurt. It's about the quiet shit that cuts deeper than yelling ever could." I didn't have anything to say to that, so I just looked down at my glass. I could feel the muscles in my jaw tightening, the way they always did when I was trying not to show emotion. Sandra noticed. She always did. "You're not wrong to be mad," she said. "But if you're looking for justice, don't expect it from a man who thinks he's done nothing wrong." She got up then, walked over to a drawer I hadn't seen in years, and pulled something out with 2 hands like it was fragile. It was a photograph, creased at the corners, clearly handled more than once. She slid it across the table to me like it might burn. It was a candid shot, me and Dad, probably from the late 90s, standing by the lake. I had a fish in my hand, and this huge grin on my face, and Dad was next to me, not looking at me, but looking at Kyle, who was just out of frame, but whose presence was obvious by the direction of Dad's eyes. It wasn't staged. It wasn't cruel. But it was clear as day. He wasn't proud of me in that moment. He was just waiting for Kyle to come into frame. "Your mom sent it to me before she passed," Sandra said. Said it was one of the only photos she didn't frame on purpose. Said it told too much truth. I held that photo like it might fall apart in my hands, the silence stretching between us like an old bridge groaning under new weight. I didn't cry. But I felt something shift, like a door closing behind me, finally and fully. "Thanks," I said, voice hoarse. I needed to hear it. "All of it." She nodded, but her eyes stayed fixed on me, like she was trying to figure out if I really heard it this time, or if I was just collecting pain like old coins. As I stood to leave, she didn't offer a hug or a smile. Just one more sentence, tossed over her shoulder as she turned to put our glasses in the sink. "If you ever get that speech out of your system, make sure it's for you, not for him. That's the only way it'll ever count." I walked out of that house feeling like I'd stepped out of a time machine with more weight in my hands than I'd brought in. But it wasn't the bad kind. It was the kind of weight that tells you where to dig. And I knew now, whatever was coming next at that cabin, I wasn't going to speak from a place of revenge. I was going to speak from the wound itself. Because now I knew where it started. I spent the next few days with a strange kind of clarity, the kind that only comes after something in you dies and leaves behind just enough room for a new plan to grow. It wasn't vengeance I was after, not exactly, and it wasn't some neat little bow to tie around the years of hurt. What I wanted, what I needed, was for them to see it all laid out plainly. No jokes, no silence, no sidestepping. Just the truth, nailed to the wall like a deer-head Dad might hang in the garage, undeniable and grotesque in its own way. So I called them both Ron first, then Kyle, and told them I was renting a cabin out by Blue Ridge for the weekend. I said I thought it'd be good for us to relive the trip, maybe make up for what got missed. I said it with enough casual ease that neither of them flinched. Ron said, "Sure, sounds like a plan," like it was just another fishing trip. Kyle asked if I was sure I wanted to do that, and I told him I'd already booked it. Which was true. I had. The same day I circled the damn date on the calendar. Then I called Tucker because someone needed to know what I was doing in case it went sideways, or if I ended up breaking something that couldn't be unbroken. We met at our usual dive bar on the outskirts of town, the one where the neon beer sign buzzes like a bad transformer and nobody asks questions about why a grown man's drinking at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. He ordered his usual, cheap whiskey with too much ice, and I laid it all out. Told him about the letter from Mom, the picture from Sandra, the phone call with Ron that left me feeling like a kid who showed up to a birthday party a day too late. I told him I was done waiting for someone to hand me closure like it was a piece of pie. "You're sure about this?" he asked, squinting at me like a man checking the pressure in a worn-out tire. "As sure as I've been about anything in 10 years, I said. "I'm not going up there to scream or throw punches. I'm going to be honest. Like brutal, look me in the eye and don't blink honest." He nodded slowly, then reached across the table and clinked his glass against mine. "Then burn the damn house down, but do it with style." The night before the trip, I sat at my kitchen table again, same place I'd read the letter from Mom, and started writing something new. This one wasn't for her. It wasn't even for Ron or Kyle. It was for me, a second letter, more of a speech, the kind I might read aloud if my voice didn't fail me. I wasn't sure yet if I'd actually say it, but I needed it on paper, needed the words to exist somewhere outside my own head. I wrote about the time I fixed up my first car in high school, how I waited all week for Ron to come see it, how he showed up, glanced at the engine, and said, "Looks fine," before walking off to ask Kyle if he wanted to go grab burgers. I wrote about the science fair I won in 8th grade, and how I stood there with a ribbon in my hand while Dad talked to another parent about how Kyle was probably going to go places. I wrote about the damn silence, the endless, hollow silence that stretched between us like a dried-up riverbed filled with missed chances and things that were never said. The next morning, I loaded up my truck with firewood, a cooler full of beer and ribs, and a bottle of whiskey I'd been saving for something that felt like a full-circle moment. I drove through winding back roads with the windows down, the radio low, and that speech folded in my glove box like a loaded weapon I wasn't sure I'd draw. I rehearsed it over and over in my head, chewing the words like gristle, rewriting them in my mind every few miles. At one point, I flashed back to the last time Ron told me he was proud of me. I was 15. I'd rebuilt a busted lawnmower engine from scratch for a school project. He didn't even come to the presentation. But when I told him about it, he grunted and said, "That's what men do, fix what's broken," and that was it. No pat on the back. No follow-up questions. Just a sentence that might as well have been stamped on my forehead as a reminder of what counted in his eyes. I pulled into the cabin lot a few hours before they were supposed to arrive. It was quiet up there, wooded, secluded, the kind of place where secrets feel louder because there's nothing around to drown them out. I stacked the firewood near the pit, cracked open a beer, and stared at the empty driveway for a long time. My hands were steady. My heart, not so much. Ron and Kyle showed up around 5. Kyle in his usual black SUV, spotless as always, like his entire life was coated in that same layer of polish. Ron stepped out of the passenger seat with his duffel over his shoulder, wearing that same old camo jacket he's had since the Clinton administration. He gave me a nod, nothing more. "Hell of a drive," he said, stretching like he was about to go hunt elk or solve a mystery. "Cabin looks nice," Kyle added, always the diplomat. We unpacked in near silence. Kyle offered to start the grill while I got the fire going. Ron, true to form, wandered off to check the perimeter, which meant nothing but sounded like something a man like him would say. I kept waiting for the nerves to hit me hard, but they didn't. Instead, I felt this weird calm, like I'd already gone through the storm days ago and now I was just walking through the wreckage. We sat around the fire as the sun went down, beer in hand, the smell of charred meat thick in the air. Nobody said anything heavy right away. We made small talk about gas prices, the weather, the usual nonsense men use to avoid saying anything that actually matters. But I knew I wasn't going to leave that night without cracking the ground open. So after Kyle flipped the last burger, I looked at both of them, my dad with his calloused hands and thousand-yard stare, and my brother who always knew how to fit into a room without ever fully belonging. And I said the words I'd been holding in my chest since the morning they drove away without me. "You two wanted a road trip," I said, voice calm but carrying enough weight to hush the fire crackle for a second. "Let's take a trip through memory lane, shall we?" Ron raised an eyebrow. Kyle went still. I reached into my jacket pocket, fingers brushing against the folded letter, and I knew in that moment, whether I read it or not didn't matter. What mattered was that I'd finally found my voice, and they were both going to hear it, like it or not. The fire crackled like a warning as I sat across from them, watching the orange light dance across faces that had grown too familiar to still feel like home. I hadn't spoken since dropping that line about the road trip and memory lane, and for a long moment, neither had they. The flames popped and the night air got heavier, the smell of smoke crawling up our sleeves and clinging to our skin like history that wouldn't wash off. Ron finally looked up from his beer, eyes steady, unreadable as ever, and Kyle shifted uncomfortably like he was waiting for a punchline that wasn't coming. "I don't know what this is supposed to be, Jake," Dad said finally, tone clipped, almost bored. "You invite us up here, feed us, then drop something like that over dinner? If you got something to say, spit it out." I took a breath that tasted like ash and memory and leaned forward, just enough to let them know I wasn't about to let the moment die easy. "You left me out of more than just that trip," I said, voice calm but hard enough to slice through the air like a blade. "You've been leaving me out since I was 10. Maybe even before that." Dad scoffed, shaking his head like I was being dramatic again, like I was rewriting history to fit some emotional script he never gave me permission to hold. "Christ, Jake. Not this again. You always think everything's about you." "That's because it never was," I snapped, louder than I meant, but not loud enough to scare me off the edge I was dancing on. "You think this is about one weekend? It's about every time you showed up for him and forgot I existed. Every game, every birthday, every time you gave him something new while I got the broken version." Kyle held up a hand, trying to step in like he always did. "Jake, come on, no," I said, turning to him. "Don't do that. Don't try to soften this. You might not have meant to, but you were part of it. You got the best of him. You got his attention. And I got the leftovers, the silence, the cold glances, the weight of trying to earn what should have come without question." Kyle looked down, but he didn't argue, which surprised me. Dad, though he wasn't ready to back down. You think I didn't have my own damn problems to deal with? He said, voice rising with old resentment. You think I had some easy life to pass down to you? I worked. I kept the roof over your head. I wasn't perfect, but don't stand there acting like you were some victim. I'm not asking for perfect, I said, almost laughing at how tired I suddenly felt. I just wanted a dad who noticed I was trying. You say you worked hard? So did I. I tried to be the kind of son you could be proud of. Hell, I shaped my whole life around it. But you never looked at me the way you looked at him. Kyle finally snapped at that, voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. You think this was easy for me? He shouted, slamming his bottle down so hard the glass cracked. You think being the golden boy was some gift? He pushed me so hard I couldn't breathe half the time. Every time I messed up, it was like I'd betrayed some image of who he thought I was supposed to be. I blinked, stunned, because Kyle never raised his voice. Not to me. Not to anyone. You never said any of that, I said. Because you never asked, he shot back. You were too busy being angry at me for what he gave me. But you didn't see the pressure. You didn't hear him in my ear after every mistake. You think I enjoyed watching you get left out? I hated it. But I was afraid if I stepped out of line, I'd end up in your seat. The empty one. The fire cracked again, a perfect beat in the tension that had suddenly shifted directions. I looked at my brother and for the first time saw something more than privilege behind his eyes. I saw panic. I saw weight. I saw a man carrying a different kind of hurt. Ron stood then, arms crossed, eyes darker than the night around us. I didn't know how to raise boys, he said, voice lower now, rough with something that might have been regret if I squinted hard enough. I only knew how to survive. I didn't have a dad worth a damn, and I figured if I kept you both tough, you'd be better off than I was. You kept us quiet, I said. You made sure we didn't ask for more. He looked at me, finally, really looked, and I saw age on him I hadn't noticed before. Maybe I was wrong, he said. Hell, maybe I screwed it all up. Silence settled again, but this time it was softer. Less like a scream buried in cotton and more like an exhausted sigh after a war nobody really won. Kyle sat back down. I did too. We didn't speak for a while, just stared into the fire like it might answer something none of us could put into words. Eventually, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the letter. The original one. Mom's letter. I held it there in my hands, turning it over once, twice, feeling its weight all over again. They both saw it, but neither said a word. I could have read it. I could have opened it and let her voice speak into the moment like a ghost settling the score. But I didn't. I looked at the flames, then back at the letter, and without a word, I tossed it in. Watched it curl and blacken, the paper folding into itself like a secret finally tired of being held. It burned fast, the edges glowing orange before collapsing into ash, and I let it go. Not because I had everything I needed, but because I'd said what I came to say, and now it was their turn to carry some of it. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. But we didn't leave either. We stayed by the fire until the wood gave out, and the only thing left was smoke and stars and 3 men finally sitting in the wreckage long enough to feel it. The morning after the fire, the cabin felt different, quieter. Yes, but not just in the usual hungover, campfire smoke stuck to your clothes kind of way. It was like something had shifted in the structure itself, like the place had been holding its breath all weekend and finally exhaled. I woke up early, earlier than I meant to, the sky just starting to change colors through the thin curtains. The embers outside were cold now, just gray bones of what had been one hell of a night, and for a second, I almost wondered if I'd dreamed the whole thing. But then I saw the empty bottle on the porch, the folding chair still turned at that slight angle where Ron had been sitting, and the crack in the bottle Kyle slammed down. It was all real. Every word, every silence, every wound finally unwrapped and left on the table like busted tools. And still, despite everything we said, there was no clean ending waiting for me, just the same men, a few more truths, and the kind of tension that feels less like a resolution and more like a pause between battles. We didn't talk much over breakfast. Kyle scrambled some eggs in the little skillet we'd found under the sink, and I brewed some terrible coffee with grounds that tasted like wet cardboard. Ron ate in silence, chewing like a man trying to figure out how to bite through 30 years of guilt without choking on it. I wanted to say something profound, something that would stitch it all together, but the truth is, there wasn't a grand finale to be had. No one suddenly became better. We weren't fixed. But we were there, sitting at the same table, and that was more than I'd had in a long, long time. After we cleaned up, they both offered to help pack, and I let them. Not because I needed the help, but because it felt right, like letting them put their hands on something real for once instead of hovering behind excuses. We didn't talk about the letter I'd burned. No one asked what was in it. And that, too, felt right. That letter wasn't meant for their ears. It was meant to die in the fire with all the parts of me that used to beg for them to understand. When we loaded the last of the stuff into the trucks, Kyle came over and looked at me like he was still searching for the right words. "I meant what I said last night," he said quietly. "I wasn't trying to be the favorite. I was just trying to survive too." I nodded, not out of agreement, but out of recognition. "Yeah," I said. "I get that now." He looked relieved. Not healed, but less tense. Like a man who'd just loosened a tie he'd been wearing since puberty. He clapped me on the shoulder, not hard, not performative, and then walked back to his car. Ron didn't say much before leaving. He just stood there a second too long, eyes narrowed like he was trying to memorize the shape of something he'd never really looked at before. "You ever want to talk?" he said, barely above a mumble. "You know where to find me." I didn't say anything back. Just gave a short nod and watched them both drive off, one after the other, tires kicking up gravel and dust that floated in the morning light like ghosts we'd finally called by name. Back inside, I sat down with the speech I'd written, the one I never read out loud. I folded it once, twice, slid it into the back pocket of my jeans, and left it there. Not because it wasn't worth saying, but because maybe some things are better known than spoken. I didn't need to explain it all anymore. I didn't need the perfect moment. I'd already lived through it. That afternoon, I got home, dumped my bag at the door, and looked around my house like it belonged to a different man than the one who'd packed for that trip. I walked into the garage, pulled the tarp off the old motorcycle I'd never gotten around to fixing, and for the first time in months, I felt like working on something that wasn't a metaphor. Something real. Something mine. By sunset, I was sitting on the porch with a fresh beer and dirty hands, grease under my fingernails, and a rare stillness in my chest. Not peace exactly, but something close. Something that didn't need to be filled with other people's approval. Later that night, my phone buzzed. A voicemail. "Ron. Next time you want to go somewhere," his voice said, rough and uncertain, "let me know. I'll ride shotgun." I didn't call him back. Not because I was angry, and not because I wanted to make a point, but because for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to be chosen by him. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was mine. Sometimes you don't need an apology. Sometimes you just need to stop waiting for it. And sometimes, the road you never took turns out to be the one you needed all along.